My mother called my miscarriage a blessing, so I made sure her perfect family fell apart. She worshipped appearances over love, played favorites with my sister's son, and treated me like I was less than nothing. But when I uncovered her deepest secret, hidden affairs, stolen church money, and a lie that shattered our bloodline, her entire world crumbled overnight. Now she's alone, disgraced, and watching the family she built burn to the ground. The sharp morning air carried the scent of winter as I sat by the kitchen window, staring at the frost-covered lawn. A thin layer of ice shimmered on the grass, reflecting the pale November sun. Thanksgiving had arrived once again, bringing with it the usual routine of family obligations, strained conversations, and my mother's ever-present need for control. I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. Outside, the neighborhood of Eden Prairie, Minnesota, was still and quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. The trees in our backyard had mostly shed their autumn colors, leaving behind skeletal branches that swayed in the wind. David's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Amy, are you ready?" I turned to see my husband standing in the doorway, already dressed in his tailored navy blue suit. He adjusted his tie absent-mindedly, his travel suitcase by his side. David had been working as an executive at an IT company, climbing the corporate ladder with quiet determination. He was thoughtful, patient, and always supportive, the kind of man who made life feel steady, even when everything else seemed to tilt. "Almost," I said, managing a small smile. "Are you sure you'll be okay?" he asked, stepping closer. I knew he felt guilty about leaving. This was the first Thanksgiving he wouldn't be there to serve as my buffer. An important business trip had come up, and while I reassured him it was fine, the reality of facing my family alone weighed heavier than I cared to admit. "I'll survive," I said lightly. "It's just dinner." David sighed, reaching for my hand. "It's never just dinner with your mother." He wasn't wrong. My mother, Martha Anderson, had built her life around appearances. She was an influential member of the First Presbyterian Church, a woman who thrived on social standing, meticulous order, and a firm belief in family tradition. Thanksgiving wasn't just a meal to her. It was a performance, a carefully orchestrated event where every detail had to be perfect. The food, the table setting, the polite small talk. It was all meant to project an image of unity and success. That image had cracked 2 years ago when I had a miscarriage. I hadn't expected sympathy from my mother, but what I got instead was something worse: relief. She never said it outright, but in subtle offhand comments, I could hear the truth beneath her words. In her mind, my loss had preserved our family's pure bloodline. Because David wasn't born and raised in our tight-knit community. Because my mother never fully accepted him. Because to her, the only grandchild that mattered was Tommy, my sister Linda's son. The moment I stepped into my mother's house, the scent of roasted turkey and warm spices greeted me. The large white colonial home, standing in one of Eden Prairie's most prestigious neighborhoods, had been in our family for generations. Inside, everything was pristine, from the gleaming hardwood floors to the carefully arranged centerpiece on the dining table. Martha was already in the kitchen, dressed immaculately in a navy blue dress and pearl necklace, her graying hair swept into a perfect chignon. "Amy," she greeted, her tone carrying the same crispness as the autumn air. "Is David really not coming?" I had barely stepped over the threshold and already we were starting. "No, he had an important meeting." A small pause. Then, with the slightest arch of her brow, "I suppose work is more important than family these days." I ignored the jab and walked past her into the kitchen. My Aunt Carol and Cousin Jennifer were already busy prepping side dishes. The oven door opened, releasing a wave of heat as Carol checked on the turkey. "Oh, Amy, it's good to see you," she said warmly. There was something in her gaze, sympathy, maybe even pity. It was the same look I had been getting ever since my miscarriage. I hated it. The doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of Linda's family. The moment Tommy stepped inside, my mother's entire demeanor changed. "Tommy, come to Grandma." Martha beamed, practically rushing forward to scoop up her 5-year-old grandson. Tommy let out a happy giggle as she smothered him in kisses. Behind them, Linda stood with a satisfied expression, her blonde hair styled in soft waves, wearing a deep green dress that complemented her effortlessly elegant image. Her husband, John, trailed behind her, his posture a little stiff, his expression harder to read. As the house filled with the sounds of greetings and laughter, I lingered in the background, observing. It wasn't just that Tommy was the favorite, it was that my mother had never even tried to hide it. "Well, Amy," Aunt Carol said later as we stood by the kitchen counter chopping vegetables, "you're always so focused on work. Don't you think it's time to find a new purpose in life?" Jennifer chimed in. "Yes, sometimes God gives us trials for a reason." I didn't need to ask what she meant. But before I could respond, my mother's voice rang out from the dining room. "Let's pray before we carve the turkey." And just like that, Thanksgiving dinner began. And just like every year, I braced myself for what was coming next. The dining room was a masterpiece of control and precision, just like my mother preferred. A long table stretched across the room, draped in an expensive linen tablecloth, set with fine china, polished silverware, and tall candlesticks flickering softly. The golden brown turkey sat in the center, glistening under the warm glow of the chandelier, an image straight out of a Thanksgiving postcard. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, butter rolls, and spiced cider, but despite the cozy warmth of the room, I felt an uneasy chill creeping in. Martha took her seat at the head of the table, her pearl necklace catching the light as she folded her hands. "Let's give thanks," she announced, and as expected, everyone bowed their heads. Her voice carried the same calm authority it always did, weaving through the familiar rhythm of grace. "We are grateful for the blessings bestowed upon us, for family, for tradition, for the strength to overcome hardships." A brief pause and then, "And we give special thanks for the future of our family, for the bloodline we are honored to carry forward." My stomach clenched, but I kept my expression still. "Amen," the family murmured in unison. Chairs scraped against the floor as plates were passed, silverware clinking against porcelain. Conversations started up again, the usual blend of neighborhood gossip, church updates, and school stories. Linda sat across from me, her polished smile never faltering as she engaged in effortless small talk with our relatives. Her husband, John, looked more reserved, occasionally glancing my way with something unreadable in his expression. My mother took up the carving knife, its silver blade gleaming, and with steady hands, she sliced into the turkey. The first few cuts were made with a practiced elegance, her lips curling into a contented smile. Then, without looking up, she spoke, her voice light but deliberate. "You know, Amy," she said as she placed a thick slice of meat onto a serving platter, "in a way, your miscarriage was a blessing. It kept our family line pure." The room went still. The knife scraped against the platter as she continued cutting, as if she hadn't just driven a nice pick into my chest. For a moment, there was no sound except for the soft hum of the chandelier overhead. Then came the laughter, light, dismissive, as if my pain was nothing more than a passing remark in polite conversation. I felt my fingers tighten around my fork. Linda leaned over and stroked Tommy's head, her smile widening. "After all," she said sweetly, "one real grandchild is enough, don't you think?" The laughter around the table swelled, blending with the clinking of glasses and the rustle of napkins unfolding. I felt like I was sinking, like the floor beneath me had shifted ever so slightly, tilting me off balance. My mother didn't even look at me, her focus still on the turkey, carving piece after perfect piece, while the rest of the family carried on as if nothing had happened. I set down my fork. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back and stood. The movement wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to cause a ripple of silence to spread through the room. Eyes turned toward me, curiosity flickering in their expressions. "Amy?" My mother's voice was calm, expectant. I met her gaze, my face unreadable. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady but firm. Without another word, I stepped away from the table, moving through the house with slow, measured steps. Behind me, the conversation hesitated, then resumed. I walked to the large bay window in the living room and stared outside. Snow had begun to fall, tiny white flakes drifting silently through the darkness. They collected on the frosted lawn, covering the garden in a thin, pristine layer. The cold pressed against the glass, but inside, the heat from the dining room clung to my skin, suffocating and heavy. The laughter from the table still reached my ears, hollow and distant. None of them knew that this would be their last family gathering. I stood by the window, watching the snowfall settle over the garden, my breath slow and controlled. The distant laughter from the dining room felt like a fading echo, detached from reality. My fingers tightened around the coffee mug I had picked up from the counter, the warmth grounding me against the cold weight pressing in my chest. I heard footsteps approaching, slow and hesitant. When I turned, John stood near the entrance of the living room, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his usual confident posture replaced by something uneasy. His gaze flickered toward the dining room, then back to me. "Amy," he said quietly, as if testing my willingness to listen. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. He exhaled, running a hand through his short brown hair. Can we talk? I gestured to the couch and we both sat, though he stayed perched on the edge, shoulders tense. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Instead, he stared at his hands like he was piecing together the right words. I studied him. John was not a man prone to hesitation. As a real estate company owner, he was used to making firm, quick decisions. Whatever was weighing on him now, it was enough to shake that confidence. It's about Tommy, he finally said. I set my mug down, keeping my expression neutral. I need your help, he continued, voice low. I want to get a DNA test. The air in the room felt heavier. I had suspected that John had doubts, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. You think he's not yours? My voice was steady, but my mind was already working. John let out a hollow chuckle, rubbing his hands together. I don't know what to think anymore. He leaned back, exhaling sharply. Linda's changed. She's been different for a while now, distant, secretive. At first, I thought it was just stress, or maybe she was getting too caught up in church politics. But then I started noticing things. The way she acts around the new assistant pastor, Adam Foster. The way they look at each other. His jaw clenched, and I could see the muscles tightening along his temple. She disappears every Wednesday afternoon, says it's for church meetings. But I checked, those meetings don't exist. And then there's Tommy. His voice faltered for a second before he continued. When I look at him, I love that kid, Amy. You know I do. But sometimes I catch myself wondering, why doesn't he look like me? Why does he have dark hair when both Linda and I are light-haired? Why does he trailed off, shaking his head. I feel like an idiot even saying this, but it's been eating at me. I need to know the truth. I sat quietly, letting the weight of his words settle. If I do this, I said carefully, and the results aren't what you want, are you ready for that? He gave a bitter smile. I don't know. But I'd rather face the truth than keep living a lie. I nodded slowly, my mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. Numbers, patterns, evidence, this was my world. As an accountant, I had built a career on detecting financial inconsistencies, uncovering hidden patterns, and piecing together stories from numbers alone. Now I would do the same with this. I'll help you, I said. But we need to be careful. If Linda gets even the slightest hint of what we're doing, she'll shut down completely. John exhaled in relief, nodding. I already ordered the test kit online. It's discreet, I just need a sample. I took a deep breath. This was no longer just a suspicion. This was a calculated search for the truth. And something told me that once we found it, there would be no going back. The next morning I sat in my home office, my laptop open, fingers poised over the keyboard. A cup of coffee steamed beside me untouched. The snow outside had thickened overnight, blanketing the neighborhood in a quiet, pristine white. Inside, however, I was wading through something much darker. Numbers had always made sense to me in ways people never did. Emotions were unpredictable, relationships could be messy, but numbers always told the truth. And if there was one thing I had learned from my years as an accountant, it was that people who were hiding something always left a trail. And I had a strong feeling Linda and Adam Foster had left one too. I started with the church financial records. As a member of First Presbyterian Church, I had access to its annual audit reports and budget allocations. I had never cared to look too closely before. My mother handled most of the financial oversight through her position in the church, but now I combed through the records with a purpose. It didn't take long to find the first anomaly. A recurring monthly transfer of funds, not a huge amount, but consistent. The money was marked under charitable outreach expenses, but there was no breakdown, no details on where exactly it was going. A closer look showed the recipient was a private account. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Private accounts were never used for church charity work. Funds were supposed to go through verified nonprofits or specific vendors. But this one? This was a direct transfer to an individual. And when I traced the account holder's name, my stomach dropped. Adam Foster. The young, charismatic assistant pastor who had arrived at the church 6 months ago. The same man John suspected Linda had been getting too close to. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. Money was moving behind the scenes. Money that my mother, as a senior church member, should have been watching. But she either hadn't noticed, or she had chosen to ignore it. A sharp knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. David. I turned, and my husband stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning my face. You're working on something, he said, more of a statement than a question. I hesitated. David knew about the DNA test John wanted, but this was bigger. I'm looking into something for John, I admitted. And I think I just found proof that Adam Foster has been taking money from the church. David's expression darkened. You think your mom knows? I don't know, I said honestly. But I have a feeling there's more to this. I need to dig deeper. I turned back to my laptop, determination hardening in my chest. If Adam was involved in financial fraud, what else was he hiding? And more importantly, was Linda wrapped up in it too? I switched my focus, this time searching through Linda's financial records. I had access to her credit card history through an old account we had once shared years ago before she got married. She probably never thought to remove my access. Scrolling through transactions, I found something that made my breath catch. Every Wednesday, like clockwork, Linda had made payments to the same business, Grayson Inn, a modest business hotel in suburban Minneapolis. The kind of place that wasn't particularly fancy but discreet. I clenched my jaw. So this was where she disappeared to every Wednesday afternoon. She wasn't attending church meetings. She wasn't running errands. She was meeting Adam Foster. I shut my laptop and exhaled slowly, the pieces of the puzzle fitting together one by one. An affair. Church funds being funneled. Lies stacked on top of lies. John had been right to be suspicious, but he had no idea how deep this went. And as I sat there staring at the cold winter light filtering through the window, I knew one thing for certain. When the truth came out, it was going to tear this family apart. I drove through the empty streets of Eden Prairie, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The heater hummed softly, but it did little to ease the cold growing inside me. The truth sat heavy on my chest. Linda had been lying. Adam Foster had been stealing. My mother had turned a blind eye. And now everything was about to unravel. Linda answered the door almost immediately, her expression shifting from mild surprise to unease when she saw me standing there. The warm glow of her perfectly decorated house did nothing to soften the tension between us. Amy, she said cautiously. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. We need to talk. She hesitated, then shut the door. All right, she said, crossing her arms. What's going on? I took a slow breath, watching her carefully. I know about the hotel, Linda. I know about the money. I know about Adam. Her entire body went still. For a split second there was nothing, just silence, just her wide, unblinking stare. Then the mask cracked. Linda's face crumpled, her hands flying to her mouth as a choked sob escaped her lips. She turned away from me, pressing herself against the wall like she could disappear into it. Oh God, she whispered. I didn't move. How long? 5 years, she admitted hoarsely. The answer hit me like ice water. 5 years. Since before Tommy was even born. Does Mom know? She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her face. She covered it up. She said it would ruin everything if people found out. She arranged my marriage to John before anyone could start asking questions. I closed my eyes for a moment, willing my pulse to slow. And Adam? What was the money for? Linda let out a bitter laugh, wiping at her face. Hush, money. Mom wanted him gone, wanted him to disappear quietly, but he wouldn't. He knew too much, so she started paying him. A sharp, nauseating anger curled in my stomach. My mother, the same woman who preached about faith and family, had been orchestrating blackmail and financial fraud behind closed doors. I turned to leave. Where are you going? Linda's voice was small, desperate. To fix this, I said coldly. Before someone else does. That someone else arrived sooner than I expected. The next morning my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered, expecting a work call, but what I heard instead turned my blood to ice. Miss Anderson? A professional, clipped voice said. Your mother has been rushed to Fairview Southdale Hospital. We suspect a stroke. For a moment everything blurred. I barely registered grabbing my keys, barely felt the drive through the city, barely processed walking into the hospital until I saw her. Martha lay in the hospital bed, her right side partially paralyzed, her once imposing presence now reduced to something frail. Machines beeped softly around her, the rhythmic sounds filling the sterile air. What happened? I finally asked the doctor. He hesitated. It seems she suffered extreme emotional distress. Apparently, there was an anonymous letter sent to the church this morning detailing financial misconduct involving both her and Pastor Foster. The world tilted. Someone had beaten me to it. The scandal had exploded overnight. By the time I checked my phone again, news of the church's financial corruption was already spreading. The Eden Prairie community wasn't just whispering, they were out for blood. Martha's entire social empire crumbled in an instant. Adam Foster had already fled. The church was launching a full investigation. The congregation was furious. And Linda? She was next. I turned away from my mother's hospital bed, her shallow breathing filling the room, and thought about what was coming. The reckoning had begun. Linda stood frozen, her face pale, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The weight of her own confession hung between us, thick and suffocating. I could see it in her eyes the moment she realized there was no undoing what had been said. 5 years. She had been involved with Adam Foster for 5 years, long enough for Tommy to be his son, long enough for my mother to orchestrate an entire marriage to cover it up, long enough for everything she had built to start crumbling. I felt nothing but cold detachment as I watched my sister break down, her hands trembling as she clutched her face. "Oh God, Amy," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." But it had. And now there was no stopping what was coming. The call came early the next morning. My phone vibrated against my nightstand, dragging me out of restless sleep, and the moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, almost detached. "Miss Anderson, your mother has been rushed to Fairview Southdale Hospital. We suspect a stroke." The words didn't fully register at first, but the sharp jolt in my chest told me this was real. Within minutes I was dressed, in my car, and driving through the empty streets. The cold November air bit through my jacket as I rushed through the hospital doors, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The sterile lights overhead seemed too bright, the faint smell of antiseptic and coffee mixing into something nauseating. When I reached the nurse's station, the doctor's words only confirmed what I already suspected. "It appears she suffered extreme emotional distress," he explained, flipping through his clipboard. "There was an anonymous letter delivered to the church this morning, detailing financial misconduct involving both her and Pastor Foster. The stress of the accusations likely triggered the stroke." I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, my pulse roaring in my ears. Someone had beaten me to it. The letter had gone public before I had even decided what to do. My mother, powerful, untouchable Martha Anderson, had been exposed overnight, and the fallout had been instant. The church community, the same people who once revered her, had turned against her without hesitation. The scandal spread faster than wildfire, whispering through every pew, spilling into every household in Eden Prairie. Adam Foster had disappeared, likely running before the full weight of the investigation caught up to him. Linda, still reeling from our conversation, was next in line for scrutiny. And my mother, the woman who had spent her life curating the perfect reputation, now lay in a hospital bed, powerless to stop it. When I finally saw her, she was a shadow of the woman I had always known. Her right side was partially paralyzed, her once imposing posture now frail against the hospital sheets. Machines beeped steadily around her, the quiet hum of medical equipment filling the room. She turned her head slightly at the sound of my footsteps, her eyes dull but searching. "Amy," she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. I sat beside her, not knowing what to say, not knowing if anything could be said at all. Her world had collapsed in a matter of hours. The church she had devoted herself to had cast her out. The community she once controlled now saw her as nothing more than a scandal. And despite everything, despite all the lies and the manipulation, despite the years of resentment I carried, I felt a strange, hollow sadness settle in my chest. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, watching as she closed her eyes, her breathing shallow, her empire reduced to nothing but a silent hospital room. Outside, the world kept moving, but inside these walls the reckoning had finally come. The fallout was swift, merciless. Adam Foster was the first to go. The church board acted immediately, issuing a formal dismissal that stripped him of his position, his influence, and any chance of staying in Eden Prairie. His disappearance was sudden, expected. One day, he was there, standing at the pulpit with his well-rehearsed charisma, and the next, he was gone, leaving behind nothing but whispers of scandal and shame. No one defended him. Not the church elders, not the congregation, not even my mother, who had once tolerated his presence to keep her secrets buried. He had been useful, a tool, and now he was nothing more than an embarrassment they wanted erased. The investigation into the missing church funds was still ongoing, but no one needed official confirmation to see the truth. Money had been stolen, and Adam had been siphoning it off for years. Linda tried to hold on, clinging to whatever fragments of status she had left, but there was no saving face. The church, the same community she had dedicated herself to, turned its back on her just as quickly. The rumors spread faster than she could control. Everyone knew now about the affair, about Tommy, about the years of lies stacked on top of each other like a house of cards finally collapsing. The whispers followed her everywhere, in the grocery store aisles, in the church parking lot, in the forced smiles of women she once considered friends. The polite invitations to social gatherings dried up. The knowing looks replaced the warm greetings. She had spent her life playing the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, and now there was nothing left to prop up that illusion. John wasted no time. He filed for divorce within a week of receiving the DNA results, cutting the ties between them with the same precision he used in business deals. He won full custody of Tommy without a fight. Linda didn't even contest it. She knew there was no point. Whatever fight she had left had drained from her the moment she realized she had lost everything. She was allowed supervised visits, but even those were limited. I saw her once, weeks later, when she came to my house unannounced, her eyes hollow, her frame thinner than I remembered. She didn't ask for sympathy, she asked for money. I refused. It was the last time I saw her. Martha's fate was sealed the moment the church severed ties with her. Without their support, without the respect she had spent a lifetime cultivating, she was just an old woman with nowhere to go. The decision to send her to a nursing home wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The doctors had made it clear she needed professional care, rehabilitation, a structured environment. She fought it at first, insisting she could recover at home, that she still had power, control, but the reality was undeniable. The paralysis on her right side made even the simplest tasks difficult, and the woman who had once commanded a room with a single glance now struggled to lift a fork. On the day of her transfer, she called for me, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Amy," she said, her fingers weak as they grasped my wrist. I might have been wrong. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get. I didn't say anything, just held her hand for a moment before stepping back, watching as the nurses wheeled her away. By the time December arrived, the damage had been done. The Anderson name, once so carefully protected, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. The scandals had passed through every household in town, chewed up and spit out in the form of hushed conversations and disapproving glances. My mother, once the most powerful woman in the church, now sat alone in a facility outside Minneapolis, her reputation stripped away like an old coat she could no longer wear. Linda, once the golden daughter, drifted further into obscurity, her world reduced to quiet shame. And me? I was the only one left standing, watching as the pieces of my family scattered like ash in the winter wind. The snow fell gently outside the window, dusting the quiet streets in soft white. It was Thanksgiving again, but this time, there were no tense family gatherings, no forced smiles, no cutting remarks hidden under the guise of tradition. Just David and me, sitting in the warm glow of our new home, far from the weight of the past. We had left Eden Prairie behind, settling in a smaller town in western Minnesota, somewhere quiet, somewhere new. The decision hadn't been dramatic, no heated arguments, no grand declarations, just the simple understanding that it was time to go. The house we chose wasn't large or extravagant, but it was ours, a place untouched by old ghosts. David set down 2 wine glasses on the table, his eyes meeting mine with quiet understanding. "It feels different this year," he said. I nodded, taking in the simplicity of our Thanksgiving dinner. Just us, no expectations, no performances. The turkey in the oven smelled rich and warm, filling the house with something that felt like peace. "It doesn't feel like something we have to survive," I murmured. On the table beside us, a stack of adoption paperwork rested neatly, waiting for the final signatures. It had taken months of discussions, late-night talks, moments of doubt and certainty woven together, but we had reached this decision together. Family wasn't blood. Family wasn't tradition or reputation or obligation. Family was something you chose, something you built with intention. We weren't replacing what had been lost, we were creating something new. David reached for my hand, his fingers wrapping around mine. "Next year," he said, glancing at the paperwork, "we might be celebrating as a family of 3. The thought settled in my chest, warm and steady. A different kind of Thanksgiving, a different kind of future, one built on truth instead of pretense. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the past, clearing the way for something new. Winter had settled deep, the streets lined with frozen branches and the hush of snowfall. Life had moved on, or at least I had. The past felt distant, a closed chapter, but some ghosts refused to stay buried. The knock on my door came late in the afternoon, hesitant but insistent. I knew before I even opened it. Linda stood there, wrapped in a thin coat that did little to shield her from the cold. Her face was gaunt, her once polished appearance worn down by something heavier than time. There was no arrogance left in her, no carefully maintained poise, just exhaustion and desperation. She didn't try to soften it. "Amy," she said, her voice small, already knowing the answer but asking anyway. "I need money." I let the words hang between us, watching as she shifted under the weight of her own choices. She wasn't crying, not yet, but there was something raw in her eyes, something close to pleading. "I can't help you," I said, and it wasn't cruel, just the truth. Linda swallowed hard, nodding like she had rehearsed this moment and still wasn't prepared for it. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I lost everything." "No," I corrected gently. "You threw everything away." She didn't argue. For the first time in her life, she had no defense, no excuse, no way to twist the narrative into something that made her the victim. She had been raised to believe she would always land on her feet, that our mother would always be there to catch her. But Martha was gone now, not in body but in power, and without that safety net, Linda had nothing. She lingered for a moment longer, as if waiting for some sign of forgiveness, some crack in my resolve. When it didn't come, she turned and walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the falling snow. John, on the other hand, had built something new from the wreckage. He had moved forward, reshaping his life around a truth that could have destroyed him. When I saw him again, months later, he looked lighter, freer. He had stopped questioning the past and focused on the present. "Tommy's my son," he told me simply. "I don't care about DNA." And he meant it. The boy who had once been a symbol of betrayal was now nothing more than his child, loved unconditionally, without resentment or doubt. It was something I respected, something I knew took more strength than walking away. I made one last visit before closing that part of my life for good. The nursing home was quiet, the soft hum of television drifting down the hallways. My mother's room was near the end, a far cry from the grand home she once ruled. She looked smaller now, older in a way that had nothing to do with age. When she saw me, she didn't react with surprise or indignation. She just sighed, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "I was wrong," she said without preamble. I sat beside her, studying the woman who had once been unshakable, now reduced to fragile honesty. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew. She let out a slow breath. "Everything." For the first time, there was no argument, no deflection, no attempt to justify her choices. Just quiet admission, the weight of regret settling over her shoulders like an old coat she could never take off. I didn't tell her it was okay. It wasn't. But it didn't matter anymore. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in something clean and new. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be left behind. And as I walked away from the nursing home, I finally let it go. A year had passed. The seasons had turned, the cold winter giving way to the slow bloom of spring, the golden warmth of summer, the crisp air of autumn, and now, once again, the soft hush of falling snow. Life had moved forward, not in sudden, dramatic shifts, but in quiet, steady steps. David and I had settled into our new home, far from the weight of the past, and for the first time in years, Thanksgiving felt like something worth celebrating. The house was filled with the comforting aroma of roasted turkey, buttered rolls, and cinnamon. The table was smaller than the ones I had grown up with, no extravagant centerpieces, no fine china, just the simple warmth of a home that felt truly ours. A fire crackled in the corner, casting a soft glow across the living room, where David stood with a quiet smile, watching as I set the last dish on the table. But this year there was someone else sitting at the table with us. She was 6 years old, with dark brown eyes that lit up whenever she laughed, her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa. Our daughter. The adoption had been finalized months ago, after long nights of paperwork, meetings, and waiting, but from the moment she had stepped into our home, she had been ours in every way that mattered. Blood had never defined family, love had. David reached for my hand, squeezing gently. "First Thanksgiving as a family of 3, he said softly. I smiled, glancing at the little girl beside us, her eyes wide with excitement as she took in the Thanksgiving feast. "Are you ready to try turkey?" I asked. She giggled, nodding eagerly, and for the first time in years, Thanksgiving wasn't a performance, wasn't something to endure, it was exactly what it should be. Outside, the snow fell in thick, gentle flakes, covering the world in something fresh and untouched. The past was behind us, buried under layers of time and forgiveness, and in its place, something new had taken root. A different kind of family. A different kind of love. A future built not on expectations or appearances, but on truth, on choice, on the quiet certainty that this was real. David lifted his glass, meeting my eyes with a knowing smile. "To new beginnings," he said. I exhaled, feeling something deep inside me finally settle. To new beginnings.